I'm Andrew Clark. I'm an ecologist working at Merseyside Environmental Advisory Service, and tonight we'll be having a talk from my colleague Phil Smith on invasive species on the Sefton coast. That talk is one of 4, so we've got a series of talks over the next few Wednesdays. So last week was climate change, tonight is invasive species, I think next week is birds and insects, and the following week we'll have a talk on community involvement, volunteering and management of the coast. So 4 talks in all, and it'd be great to see anybody at those talks as well. The nature conservation strategy exists already, so we have a strategy, but it lapsed in 2015, and Natural England have given us some money to be able to update that project and do some consultation engagement activities around that. So that's one of the reasons why we're able to do this event tonight and the other talks. So ourselves, Merseyside EAS, working with Sefton Council and also the Sefton Coast Landscape Partnership, who are a partnership of individuals and organisations with an interest in the coast. So before we get into the detail, just a bit of housekeeping. So a rough agenda for tonight. I'm just doing some introductions, then I'll hand over to Phil for 30 to 40 minute talk. Then we'll have probably about 10 to 15 minutes for any questions you might have. And if you haven't already, please sign in on the sheet that's going around the room. This session will be recorded, so we can share with other people, and we'll circulate it to everybody who's put their email down tonight. We don't have a fire drill tonight, so if the alarm does go off, then the fire exit is through that door and to your right, or back out that way. The toilets are through that way to your left, and the kitchen's that way if you want a cup of tea and biscuit. I think that covers it for housekeeping. And also, if you parked in the car park just out there, I'll be locking up tonight, so I'll be last one out, so you're not going to get locked in. So, okay, so really briefly, the Sefton Coast. The Sefton Coast is a unique landscape. It stretches over 20 miles from Crosby in the south to all the way up to really Marshside and Southport in the north. There's multiple layers of nature conservation designation, so you probably know it's recognised internationally for the habitats and species that are present. One of the reasons why we're being funded to do a nature conservation strategy is because of the complexity of the coast. So there are multiple landowners. The complexity, I think, of the environment as well. So we've got this sand dune coast, but we've also got 3 estuaries, the Mersey in the south, the Alt roughly in the middle, and then obviously the Ribble in the north. It is the largest continuous sand dune system in England, and it's also a stronghold for species such as natterjack toad, sand lizard, and great crested newt, and petalwort. But apart from the nature conservation interest, it's also a really popular tourist destination, as you can see today. And it's also important for port and industry in the south, and other kind of tourism and commercial interests. So we've got multiple golf courses, we've also got Ministry of Defence sites. So there's a lot of kind of different conflicting interests on the coast. And all of that makes for a sort of perfect storm in terms of trying to manage threats and pressures and ensure that the coast is in good condition. On condition, I thought it was just worth highlighting that actually less than a quarter of all of the units, so there's 34 units that make up the Sefton Coast site of special scientific interest, and of those 34, less than a quarter are actually in favourable condition. The rest are all in some level of unfavourable condition. And that's due to a variety of factors. So that's really kind of the overall aim of the nature conservation strategy, to try and improve the condition of the site, and in doing so making it a better place for people and wildlife. I mentioned earlier that the nature conservation strategy isn't new, so it was previously written in the noughties and it lapsed in 2015. And that plan highlighted a number of challenges, so climate change, communications, conservation of water sources, maintaining geomorphological processes, which are so important in a dynamic system such as the Sefton coast. And these changes haven't really changed. So the partnership and Merseyside ES did an exercise a couple of months ago, and just looking at, well, from the previous plan, what's changed, and actually all of those things are still relevant. And actually there's a lot more kind of issues that we need to address. And we left the European Union, we have new legislation, so we need to make sure that that plan is set kind of within that new landscape of legislation. Things like biodiversity net gain, local nature recovery strategies, they're all opportunities, I think, to potentially bring investment to the coast and improve the condition of the site. So there's a lot of kind of things there that we need to consider in updating the nature conservation strategy, including invasive species management. And all of these are long-term challenges and are generally getting worse. So as I said, we're having this summer talk series. The first one was last week in Southport, and if you'd like to catch up on that, we'll circulate a link to the website. Tonight, Phil, here in Ainsdale, giving us a talk on invasive species. Next week, John Dempsey will be giving us a talk on birds and insect trends. And then the final talk, as I said, will be on community involvement, engagement and management. And they're both at Bootle Town Hall, if you'd like to come. That's not all we're doing, so we're planning to launch an online survey, probably in the first week of September, and that'll run for 8 weeks. So that's just asking you questions about what's, your thoughts and opinions about the Sefton coast. We're also planning to do some young person focused events, so we're working with different departments in Sefton Council to try and engage with younger people. And we're planning some workshops in probably October, November time to sit down and kind of actually have a more interactive session rather than us just talking to you. But tonight was kind of more about awareness raising. And that the intention is that all of that information that we glean from the consultation will feed into the updated nature conservation strategy, which we plan to publish hopefully by spring, summer next year. That's just about it from me. There's more information on our website, which we can send a link to, and that's our email address. So I think that's it from me, and over to you, Phil.
Well, good evening, everybody. Nice to see a full house. Incredible. I usually do a quick count, but I'll save that for the oyster catchers, I think. Right, well, my talk, as the first slide indicates, is about invasive plants on the Sefton coast. Not just invasive species, invasive plants, which is more important. And what can be done about them? And the first thing really is, can we have a definition of what we mean by invasive plants? Try and get this better place. So, that's great. This is a rather vague and sort of catch-all definition I got out of the literature. Plants that attain a substantial proportion of the invaded plant community. I think what they're trying to get at there is an invasive plant sort of covers the ground and makes it very difficult for any other plants to compete with it. I think that's basically what it means. It's a bit vague. Now, it's not widely appreciated, I think, that invasive plants are really one of the world's greatest environmental problems. They do major damage to ecosystems. and infrastructure. They cost millions of pounds in control programs. So they're extremely important worldwide. And here on the Sefton coast, we've got our fair share of problems as well. Partly because we have a very high proportion of non-native introduced plants as part of our flora. Something like 40% of our flora on the sand dunes is non-native. These are mainly things that have escaped from gardens, although as we'll see later on, some of them have been deliberately introduced. These data actually come from a study I did, published in 2020 in a scientific journal, and I'll refer to some of those data later on. It also turns out that another problem we have with invasives is that the rather open sort of habitats that we have on the sand dunes makes them particularly susceptible to plant invasions. This has been found all over Europe. But luckily, only about 5% of introduced plants ever become a problem. In my study, I found that there were about 24 non-native invasives on the Sefton coast and about 14 native plants that had invasive characteristics. In fact, some botanists call them thugs. These are native plants that have a rather unfortunate habit of becoming invasive. I'll mention one or two later on. Now these plants, the invasive ones, of course, affect the whole of the dune system, including the coastal gateways, which are a feature of the nature conservation strategy. And therefore their control needs to be addressed in the update of the nature conservation strategy, which Andrew is working on. Good luck with that. Easily the worst offenders are two species, the sea buckthorn and the Japanese rose. I'll deal with the sea buckthorn first. Both of them are very spiny shrubs, as you probably know. Sea buckthorn is actually native on the east coast of Britain, but not on the west. It was introduced here in the 1890s. In fact, we think about 1898. By private landowners, both to reduce sand blow and also to create hedges to keep out trespassers. They were absolutely paranoid about trespass in those days. But especially since the 1960s, the sea buckthorn has spread, partly because of the decline of rabbits, whose nibbling used to keep it under control, at least to some extent. It colonises by two main means. First of all, by these orange berries, which must be familiar to you, which are eaten by birds and then dispersed, obviously, in their droppings. But also, once the plants become established, they produce these root suckers, which rapidly increase the size of the bushes. And eventually they can completely dominate the landscape, just down the road here. And of course, once they've got to this stage, they're going to exclude the special plants and animals for which the sand dunes are famous and for which we have a nature conservation strategy. I should also mention that they also restrict access to visitors. Which is obviously a concern for the coastal gateways, especially, for example, here at Ainsdale-on-Sea. Try to get through that if you can. I don't recommend it. Pays not to go too deeply into sea buckthorn, I think somebody said once. Another problem with sea buckthorn is that it has root nodules, the little white blobs that you can see on the slide now. Is that in focus?
Yeah.
It looks a bit odd from here. These nodules contain bacteria which have the ability to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. And of course they then pass that into the soil eventually, and that enriches the sandy soil, making it less suitable for the plants that normally grow here, which are adapted to growing in very low nutrient conditions. Attempts to control sea buckthorn in the dunes began on a small scale back in the 1950s and have increased in later decades as the problem has just got worse and worse. The most effective method seems to be to pull the bushes up by the roots using heavy machinery like this, and then get rid of the material. A lot of it's produced, of course. You can burn it, it's one way of getting rid of it, and then bury the ash, which is nutrient rich, of course. Or you can chip it and use the chippings for various purposes, including surfacing roads or pathways and so on. One of the benefits of mechanical control is that it produces lots of bare sand. One of our problems is that we don't have enough bare sand anymore. We used to have a lot, but we've lost over 80% of it since the 1940s. And bare sand is very important for many of the plants and animals that live on the sand dunes, including things like the spectacular northern dune tiger beetle, for which there are only 2 localities in Britain. That needs bare sand, but of course, once you've cut down the sea buckthorn, or dug it up, or pulled it up, there's always the possibility of any root fragments remaining regrowing. So you have to have several years of aftercare. Obviously, this sort of work is very expensive, and finding funds has always been difficult, especially since austerity policies came in 2010. Much cheaper management alternative is to use very willing volunteers, some of which are in the audience. They, of course, can only work with hand tools and therefore can only tackle the smaller bushes and the regrowth. But since 2012, I've organised a volunteer group called the Buckthorn Bashers in an attempt to control sea buckthorn in a fairly limited area on the dunes just across the other side of Shore Road there. We have an area of about 15 hectares, which is quite substantial. It's a very rich area from a biodiversity point of view, close to the Ainsdale Gateway. We found that by repeated cutting every year for at least 5 years, we eliminated the plant from the seasonally flooded dune slacks that you see in the background there, but were less successful on the drier ridges, although the size and vigour of the bushes was very much reduced. Hand pulling of younger plants is also a very effective way of preventing invasion of new habitat. This is actually a bit bigger than what we normally deal with. There's a friend of mine who was exercising his muscles, I think. Hand pulling like this has actually been very useful on the younger areas of habitat that have been produced on the what we call the green beach between Ainsdale and Birkdale. The southern end of that system has been kept pretty well free of sea buckthorn by hand pulling thousands of seedlings every year. Now, to prevent the buckthorn coming back, regrowing or reinvading, conservation grazing by hardy breeds of livestock was introduced in the 1990s on the various sand dune nature reserves. Grazers including the Herdwick sheep there from the Lake District, and also belted Galloways, rather attractive cattle, and also latterly English Longhorns. Let's move on now to the Japanese rose. As the name implies, this shrub came originally from the Far East. It's widely grown in gardens. I hope none of you have it. No acknowledgement. It's grown especially for hedging, but it easily escapes into the lowland countryside. It doesn't like growing up in the mountains, via seeds that are spread by birds. Also, the hips that it produces these large red hips, they float. And so where the plants are near to the sea, they can be dispersed by the tide and wash up in faraway places. There are islands in the Baltic, for example, that have been completely colonised by this thing as a result of transmission by the sea. But rather like the sea buckthorn, Japanese rose is highly invasive in sand dunes, and it also alters the soil chemistry. So it's not good stuff at all. Mounting concern about its recent spread in the Sefton dunes led to a volunteer survey being organised back in 2014. The idea being to find out how much of it we've got, and we actually managed to recruit 47 volunteers. The results, or the basic results, are there. The number of bushes found, nearly 500, covering about 6 hectares or 15 acres in old money, if you prefer it, in the coastal zone between Seaforth and Crossings. And a separate study found that the patches, or larger patches, were growing at a rate of about 20% per annum, therefore doubling every 4 to 5 years. A frightening prospect. Here are some of the results that we obtained. The dots show the positions of bushes or patches of Japanese rose along the coast. On the left, the northern section, on the right, the southern section. And you perhaps notice that there's a gap in the distribution here and here. That's Formby Point, of course. And the reason for that is that Formby Point is being eroded by the sea, so that if young bushes try to grow near the sea, they get washed away. And you can see the distribution there is mainly close to the sea, on the younger sand dunes. Now, the results of this survey and others led to a major control programme starting in 2017. And again, it was found that the best method of dealing with Japanese rose was to pull the plants up by the roots using big machines. And then best way of getting rid of it was to actually bury it 2 metres down. Had to be 2 metres down, otherwise it recovers, it regrows. Here we have an aerial photograph of part of the Birkdale Hills showing the bare patches of sand created by the removal of Japanese rose clumps in 2022-3. Now again, like the sea buckthorn, you've got to address regrowth, because if you leave little bits of root in the ground, they will regrow, as you see here. So up to 5 years of annual treatment is necessary using an approved herbicide, and it does work, as you can see. There's a little Japanese rose bush, nice and dead, which is the way we like to see it. Otherwise, herbicides are generally avoided if possible to prevent environmental contamination. It's not always realised, actually, that it is an offence to plant or otherwise cause the Japanese rose to grow wild in Britain. Nevertheless, it's legal to sell the plant here. And as you probably know, it's widely advertised, it's stocked in garden centres, and it's recommended on TV gardening programmes by the likes of Monty Don. And in magazines as well. And that's despite the fact that it's well known now that it causes huge amounts of damage to wildlife sites and costs an enormous amount to control it. The control effort on the Sefton coast is costing tens of thousands of pounds. Fortunately, most of that is being funded by the National Dynamic Dunescapes project, which is supported by the Life Nature Programme of the European Union. All the money was allocated before we left the EU, but we won't get it again, which is rather unfortunate. Now, I mentioned earlier that other plants are invasive, other non-natives are invasive on the dunes, and these are obviously also merited our attention. And one is this rampant woody climber, traveller's joy, or old man's beard it used to be called. It's a wild clematis. It's actually native in southern Britain, but it was introduced here several decades ago, probably as a garden escape. It can easily spread by wind-blown seeds. So those are the very familiar seeds that it produces, and they blow around, of course, in the winter. It's been known as an invasive on the east coast of Britain, in 2 or 3 different national nature reserves for quite a while. But it has increased dramatically on the Sefton coast just over the last 5 years or so, and especially in the Ainsdale and Birkdale Sandhills local nature reserve. Now, in response to this apparent spread, last year, 2023, I organised a survey with some friends of mine, some of whom are here, to measure the extent of the traveller's joy and decide whether management was justified. And you see some of the results here. We measured 117 patches with a total area of 0.64 hectares or 1.6 acres. We had no idea there was so much of it. We were rather amazed. All but 2 of the patches were in the LNR that I've just described, affecting both semi-fixed and fixed dune habitats that have a high conservation value. I can show you some of the distribution maps. Well, that shows it well. The darker colours there are large patches, and the yellow ones are the small patches. This is the northern part of its distribution in the Birkdale Sandhills. This is Sands Lake at the bottom here. And then if I go to the southern section here, this is Ainsdale Local Nature Reserve. And one of the things that you can see from this diagram is that there appear to be clusters of the plant with a few large patches and some smaller ones around them. Doesn't always apply, but there are 2 or 3 there that show it quite well. We think this is because You've got vegetative spread, and you've also got seed production, which will tend to germinate close to the original parent. And vegetative spread in this particular species is very considerable. We've measured the current year's stem growth, and the maximum we had was 3.2 metres. So that's about 10 feet of spread in 1 year by one plant, which is absolutely incredible. So our conclusions really were that Traveller's Joy, first of all, has known invasive characters, and its rapid increase on the Ainsdale-Birkdale Local Nature Reserve provides really a strong case for urgent management action. Having said that, the control of this plant is not easy. On the east coast, mechanical removal followed by treatment of regrowth with selective herbicides is ongoing. The results are not yet available, unfortunately. Millions of dollars have been spent in New Zealand trying to control it. There it's a major problem in fragments of native woodland. It's enormously damaging in New Zealand. And here a variety of different selective herbicides have been trialled, and therefore we know which chemicals actually do kill it, which is helpful if we get a control program working here. Another invasive non-native that is causing concern here is the broad-leaved everlasting pea, Lathyrus latifolius. It's a gardenscape. It looks a bit like the familiar sweet pea with deep pink or white flowers, and it's been known on the Sefton coast for over a century. But it only started to increase dramatically in 2005. And it's now really widespread in semi-fixed and fixed dunes, especially near the Ainsdale Gateway. That's what it looks like when it first really starts to take off. And the same site roughly a few years later looks like that. So you can see it's spreading dramatically. As a member of the pea family, it can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and therefore enrich the soil. We're finding it difficult to work out how it spreads. It produces large pods, about the same size as your garden pea pod, and the seeds are quite large and round and heavy. They don't really seem to have any obvious means of dispersal, and yet patches of the pea sort of climb up dune slopes and they appear on the tops of crests and so on. And there seems to be no apparent way in which that's happened. It rather suggests that the seeds are moved by forces other than gravity. Perhaps small mammals are involved, but the seeds are said to be poisonous, so it's a complete mystery. And also, rather strangely, this plant, the broadleaf everlasting pea, has not been reported as a serious problem in any other UK dune system. So there's no literature on its management, and therefore obviously more research is needed. Now my research into introduced plants on the dunes also identified several native plants that were invasive. Remember I put a slide up earlier on. The worst of those is this chappy, grey willow, Salix cinerea. It's a very common shrub, and it invades dune slacks that support many of our rarest plants and animals, like natterjack toads and grey-crested newts and so on. And after about 30 years, that's what it looks like. It becomes completely dominant. very little survives under its dense shade. You certainly aren't going to find any natterjacks in there. However, it does also have its benefits for wildlife. It's a very good food plant for many insects. This is a caterpillar of a buff-tipped moth. It's also an important source in the springtime of pollen and nectar when the catkins appear, usually towards the end of March. Attempts have been made to control it selectively, particularly at the Cabin Hill National Nature Reserve just south of Formby. Cutting it and treating the stumps. This was done on quite a large scale in 2005, for example, where afterwards, a year later, you could see really quite a dramatic recovery, spectacular recovery of the plant life in the slack. Now, climate change. Climate change is probably going to mean that some relatively innocuous plants that we see about at the moment are going to be a problem in the future as things warm up. An example of that is the yucca, which some of you may have in your gardens. This one is the Spanish dagger, I think is its English name, Yucca gloriosa. This is a photograph I took on the sand dunes, and there are a few individual plants and small groups of plants here and there scattered quite widely in the dunes, but really quite rarely at the moment. And they're not showing very much tendency to increase, because I'm keeping my beady eye on them, obviously. But as things get warmer, they may do so. Another one to be wary of is the pampas grass, Cortaderia. Like the yucca, this chap is very problematic down around the Mediterranean, on the sand dunes around the Mediterranean. It's become very invasive down there. And so there is obvious concern that as temperatures rise, it might become a problem here. In fact, I found, these are obviously escaped from the nearby gardens, but I found, I think, 3 small plants on the Birkdale Green Beach recently. So there's a potential there for it to spread, and we certainly don't want it. So I've really only had time to discuss a handful of our problem plants. As I said at the outset, invasive plants are one of our most important environmental problems, and I haven't even mentioned Japanese knotweed. You certainly don't want that in your garden. So, in conclusion then, the key to managing invasives successfully, I suggest, is first of all good observation and recording, doing the sorts of volunteer surveys, for example, that I've described, making sure that once the records are obtained, that they are published. Very important to publish everything. Secondly, an ability, which not all organisations have, to react quickly. Because these things take off rather suddenly. They will sit there for, in some cases, decades doing very little, and then suddenly explode. And if they do, you have to be able to react to that situation. And then finally, of course, the availability of funds and manpower. Extremely important, because if we don't have any money, we're not going to be able to hire big vehicles or buy chemicals to treat invasives. And finally, I'll just stick up a couple of references for anyone who wants to find out more about this subject. It's a big subject. There is lots and lots of published material, and these two reports have got pages and pages of references. So if anybody wants to follow it up, those are the sources that you need to use. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil.